Wonderful. I actually remembered this time to do it right at the beginning. Very good. So let me share my screen and I'll put our deck up and then I will explain how this is going to work. All right. So I just want to say welcome to all of you. This is the first of our series that is on high impact teaching practices and best practices. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about the series and what this is about and what we are doing here. And then we'll get into the content and talk about metacognition, which is one of my favorite topics. So first, sorry, there we go. Okay, so first I want to start with the mission of the faculty development here at CUSM. So our mission is to promote teaching excellence and an institutional culture of lifelong learning and iterative professional growth. We also want to enable faculty learning and the implementation of student-centered and evidence-based teaching practices. And we want to expand the university's capacity for teaching and learning support. So how we will do that is that we are going to be an intentionally fertile space for faculty and staff to grow professionally in order to support the learning and success of our students and the university's mission as well. So this series has come out of that mission and vision. And this particular series is about having a space to come together and learn and explore some of the foundational literature on teaching and learning. And so we're focusing on high impact teaching practices and best practices. And so you'll see that acronym because there's no way we're going to write that out everywhere, all over our literature. It's just too cumbersome. So high impact teaching and best practices. And we're going to have a monthly series. And this will provide space to discuss those practices, the practices that we find in the literature and how those apply to our individual teaching practice and to our collective approach to teaching here at CUSM. We are also going to use these sessions as an opportunity to create, over time, to create a toolkit to support our teaching practice here. So what does that mean? It means that at the end of this semester in the summer, we will take all of the different things that we have covered in this series. We'll take them and we'll put them into a toolkit, sometimes called a learning aid, but I think a toolkit is a little bit more of what it is. And that can be a reference guide for us and for all of us as faculty to refer to and to talk about as we're constructing our instruction, as we're looking to see how we implement some of these best practices and get them into our practice. So that will be something that we will produce and we'll send it out at the end of the term. We'll let you know and hopefully it will be helpful. So logistically, what is this session or what does this series look like? So we will meet for this series. It will be the first week of every month. And it will be faculty facilitated conversations centered on these things. So there will be a little bit of, right now there's me talking and then there's going to be a little bit more of me talking. And that will be providing an overview of the piece of literature that we're reviewing today and that we're discussing. But most of the session, I want to be conversation about the implications of the literature, understanding it, understanding what it means, exploring ideas together. And so that is the goal and that is the intention. So we'll see how it goes. And I hope that you enjoy this time in this space to talk about this with your colleagues. So I know that some of us come in and we use this hour to eat lunch and get all of kind of those things done. and do desk work while the session is up. And that is no problem at all. I want you to know that you're welcome to do that. The second half, though, is going to be conversation. And so I would urge you to sort of have your mouse ready to unmute yourself if you have things to say for that second part for the conversation. So that's kind of a preview. So let's get into it. And we're going to be talking today about metacognition. I wanted to start with something that is foundational to teaching and learning, and something that has been very significant for me in my own research. And my dissertation was on metacognition in community college teaching practice. And so you can't really talk about metacognition without talking about Pintrick. And there's a lot of stuff on metacognition that is out there and it's applied. And I know that this is a rather old article, but this is the article we're discussing today because it is a foundational article. I wouldn't call it seminal, but it's certainly foundational in understanding how we perceive metacognition happening today. So that's the article. We're going to put it in the chat too, unless it's even already there. So we'll put the article in the chat, and I can't, let me see. Oh, the article's in the chat. Thank you very much, Shannon. Appreciate it. There we go. Now I have the chat up and I can see what if people have anything to say. Okay, so the tools here, working on 3 screens. Sometimes the mouse doesn't want to work. So we're going to start. This article begins, I want to frame the discussion within the literature. It all began with Bloom. In fact, it didn't all begin there, but Bloom's taxonomy is probably the thing that that most of us have heard of. Even if we're not super familiar with it, we've either heard of it, we've worked with it. Some of us may be very, very familiar with it. And so Bloom published his taxonomy of learning in 1956. And then in response to that, after many decades, Anderson and Krathwohl and a couple of other people, including Pintrick, who has authored this article, they got together and they created a revised taxonomy. And you can see here the 2 different taxonomies. They're very similar, but there was a sense that it wasn't quite right and it needed some adjusting as we were understanding and doing more research and learning and how learning worked, and it needed to be updated. So that happened in 2001 with Anderson and Krathwohl's revised taxonomy, and they published that. And if you are look up Bloom's taxonomy, you will probably find Anderson and Krathwohl's revised taxonomy, and that's probably the one that you will see and will be using. Now, the main thing that it did is that it added, Anderson and Krathwohl added a metacognitive knowledge category to it. And that's why we're talking about it here. They added this category in 2001, and you can see it here in the diagram. There are 4 kinds of knowledge that they, in their schema, there's factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. And they felt that Bloom's taxonomy was not a sufficient taxonomy unless it also included metacognitive knowledge. And so they added that in. And so the article's purpose, as Pintrick identifies it, is to discuss the metacognitive knowledge category and its implications for learning, teaching, and assessing in the classroom. A brief aside, and that is that in these sessions, we'll be looking at literature, and we may bring in literature that is, we may bring in literature reviews, we may bring in theoretical articles. This is a little bit closer to that, but theory into practice. We may also bring in empirical studies too. This is kind of none of those particularly, but it's closer to a theoretical piece. So we're going to talk about the metacognitive knowledge category and what is it and how does it all work out and what are its implications. So Pintrick begins in this article by making a distinction, and it's an important distinction. The distinction between metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive control. And so I'm certain you can all see the difference and understand the difference. Knowledge, the metacognitive knowledge is the knowledge of these things, the cognitive processes that we use to regulate cognition, regulate learning, to monitor, to control, all of those things. The control, metacognitive control, though, is not just the knowledge, but the ability to do it. And so when we're talking about metacognition, it's important to keep those two things clear, because sometimes in the literature, people use them in different ways. And we want our students, of course, to not just have knowledge, but also have metacognitive control. So there are three types of metacognitive knowledge. There's strategic knowledge, knowledge about cognitive tasks, and self-knowledge. So we're going to work through these. The article works through these and explains kind of an overview of these things. Strategic knowledge is general strategies for learning, thinking, and problem solving. There are three different groups of general learning strategies. So there's rehearsal, which is drilling things. Flashcards come to mind, and 7th and 8th grade, and drilling certain kinds of, younger, I suppose, drilling certain kinds of things in mathematics, in language acquisition. So I remember taking my Spanish class and just having to do rehearsal. Elaboration is, of course, where you expand on a thing, and you talk about it in terms of not just reviewing it over and over again, but you explore, you expand, you describe. That's a learning strategy as well. What are the implications of this? And then organizational, learning how the different parts relate to the whole. So these three general learning strategies are identified. They were identified by Weinstein and Mayer. Then there are also, in strategic knowledge, there's knowledge of metacognitive strategies. So there are general learning strategies that are important to know in strategic knowledge, but also metacognitive strategies to know. Planning, monitoring, regulating your own learning and thinking. So setting sub-goals, this is cognition planning. Cognition monitoring, checking to make sure that you are on task, checking to see how well your understanding is, and then also then rereading, something like rereading something that was not understood. You might identify this, you might go back and say, hey, listen, I didn't get that. You've monitored, I'm going to go back and use a metacognitive strategy to regulate this and to review this piece that I didn't understand. We have general problem solving and thinking strategies. This is on there because there are often strategies and knowledge that's needed that are not particularly specific. So these are, like it says, these are for problems that don't have a clear, clean algorithmic solution. So inferring from samples, evaluating validity, things like that. Those are things that are general problem solving, and we might call them higher order, but they're a different class here of strategic knowledge. So the second kind is knowledge about cognitive tasks, and this is important, knowing when and why to use a certain strategy. And that includes contextual knowledge, that includes cultural norms. Those are included in this kind of metacognitive knowledge about cognitive tasks. So not just knowing the tool. If we were imagining the previous category were the actual tools that were used, this knowledge would be knowledge about the tasks and when the appropriate tool should be used. It'd be the knowledge about which tool for what purpose. The third type of metacognitive knowledge that Pinter talks about in this article is self-knowledge, the knowledge of one's own strengths and weaknesses, of course. So it's nice to have the tools, it's nice to know when to use them, but we also need to know own capability, where we're strong, where we're weak, and then we can modify our strategies accordingly. So there's general self-knowledge, and I think it's important to note here, this kind of general self-knowledge is something that by definition students lack, but experts have this. By definition, an expert is someone with general self-knowledge. They have deep specific knowledge, but also general self-knowledge. So they know, an expert knows when they are, when they don't know the answer and when they need to go seek out someone else who does, or collaborate with someone with more knowledge, or they know when they need to look something up. Often students don't have that, and they don't know where their limitations are. Right? So then beliefs about motivation. This is significant. So this is delving into and connecting to motivation and motivation theory, but motivational beliefs are really, they're linked to cognition and learning. And there are studies that have been done that are very significant that show that. It's a very important thing. Motivational beliefs are very important with learning. Additionally, so is accurate self-knowledge, as we all know. Excuse me. As we all know, accurate self-knowledge, students have to know, they have to have an accurate understanding of what they know and don't know. If they think that they know a whole lot more, they're going to be toast when it comes to the exam. So accurate self-knowledge is critical. And it's worth pausing here to linger on something that Pintrick pointed out, which is that ensuring that students have accurate self-knowledge is sometimes confused or misrepresented as, you just want to make sure that they have good self-esteem. And self-esteem is a very different construct than self-efficacy even, but self-esteem is a different construct than ensuring accurate self-knowledge. So the goal here in self-knowledge is to ensure that students have accurate self-knowledge, it doesn't really have anything to do with self-esteem. Now, that was the section of the article that talked kind of about these constructs. So now I'd like to talk about the implications that Pintrick identifies, and we'll go through and talk about a few. I'll identify those implications, and then I will stop talking at you, and we can talk together about what this means for us in our teaching practice. So first, the first nugget that we can get from this is that student learning and success, when you have metacognitive knowledge, student learning and success increases. Metacognitive knowledge increases, it tends to increase student learning and success, right? So these are kind of foundational things, these are basic things, but they're very important for understanding metacognition. Transfer of learning also is supported and enabled by metacognitive knowledge increase. You increase metacognitive knowledge, typically, you have greater learning transfer. And it makes sense when you think about it, because students they're thinking about they're evaluating themselves, they are self-regulating, and then they're able to more accurately use the strategies that are needed in a particular environment. And so that means learning transfer is more likely. So Pintrick also points out that self-knowledge can be either an important facilitator or a constraint. What he means there is the lack of self-knowledge can be a constraint. So self-knowledge can it can be very helpful when students understand their own processes, their own cognition. Obviously, they're more likely to leverage those. They're more likely to use those and understand those. And if they don't have that knowledge, they don't know, they don't have those levers, they don't have those tools to use, to implement. I'm sorry, Raj, I just saw your question, and I think I'll work through the implications and then we'll start with yours for the conversation. I just wanted you to know I'm not ignoring you. So some other implications. Pintrick says that we need to teach metacognitive strategies explicitly. And this is often where educators kind of cock their heads a little bit and say, yeah, but I already do that. I teach metacognition. And Pintrick says, yeah, but we need to be teaching it explicitly. Many people teach it implicitly. They might say, oh, no, I have metacognitive strategies, and we fold those in. But he says, listen, explicit instruction's needed. We need to explicitly teach this and label it, and embed it in content-driven lessons. So not just say, hey, we're having a metacognitive unit now, but rather have it ongoing in our in the content lessons, so that students can understand and see and transfer that learning to specific scenarios. Next, teachers should include learning goals related to teaching metacognition, right? So this makes sense if you're including metacognition as part of your instructional session. There should be learning goals related to that, right? So so he says, listen, explicit instruction is needed. Yes, write out a learning goal for it, even get that explicit with it, and assess for it. He says, let's assess for metacognition too. There are ways to do that, of course. A couple of final pieces here on the implications. Going back to explicit teaching of metacognition, he also says, let's pair that with explicit labeling of metacognition. So don't just explicitly teach it, but let's use those explicit labels. Let's use the nomenclature that's appropriate for metacognition. And that will help our learners connect those strategies to previous knowledge that they may have had, previous strategies they may have learned, and say, oh, that is what this is. Because most of our students and most of us, we've been taught many things related to metacognition, but we sometimes don't know it unless it's pointed out. It also creates a common vocabulary set. It creates a set of language that we can use to then engage in discourse about these things with our students and with each other, and have an explicit language set that we can use. That's very, very helpful. It increases student awareness, and that will increase how students attend to these things if there is a specific language set around them. If it's not, if it's minimized in our language set, then it will be minimized in the mind of the student as well, and in our own. And then important, very important, Pintrick says is, listen, we also need to model metacognitive strategies to our students. Okay, so this is particularly valuable when we have an expert modeling for, a brand new student who's an acolyte. We need that learner needs not only to hear about those, but they need to see it in action, and see that modeling, not just to see how it works, but also to hear, why did you pick this strategy for this problem? And as experts, we know why we do that. And often we internalize those reasons. They need instruction in it, otherwise they won't understand that. And those are sometimes things that experts forget. And so it's important to bring that up. In the educational business, particularly in certain fields of education, certain subfields, this particular piece is called a think aloud or a read aloud. So you'll have students read aloud, read something aloud. If this is particularly in reading instruction, you'll have students read something aloud and then talk out their metacognitive process. But also you can have students do this, and you can have instructors model this through what's called a think aloud, which is, so if you've heard of a think aloud, that's this. And if you want a nice term to attach to this that's short and easy and helpful, I like the term think aloud, and that is the term in the literature. So more. Pintrick suggests that we can use informal assessment. So if you're trying to figure out how how much do my students understand metacognition, and what is their understanding level of metacognition? He says, listen, there are some informal assessments. He says, really, you just talk to them about it, and it does not take long before you can understand an informal conversation before or after during class. It doesn't take long to understand where your students are with metacognitive strategies if you just talk to them in an informal way. There are other pieces of literature that have more on that, but it's mostly referencing that here. And then the final piece, the final implication rather, is that students need to be also given the opportunity to self-evaluate. They need to be given opportunities to have specifically metacognitive self-evaluation, and space for that, specific times for that, where we ask them to do this and we show them how to do that. And so that is very important, that it's done, if it's done with the instructor, that it's done one-on-one, so that it's not in front of a class or in a group of people necessarily, because that will help ensure that motivation isn't damaged or depleted. If they didn't do well, we want to make sure that they build self-efficacy, they build motivation, rather than that being eroded through that evaluation process. That is the overview of this article. You have the article there. These are the references that I specifically used in the presentation. And now I would like to turn to discussion. So I would like us to talk about, now, this can look a variety of ways. I want this discussion to be driven by what everyone here is interested in, and not by necessarily the questions that I posed. But I posed some questions to get us started thinking if we need help with that. I would like to come back to what Raj said, and he asked, does strategic knowledge, which includes general problem solving, belong to the apply level in the revised Bloom's taxonomy? So this is, I think that Pintrick would say it applies to the metacognitive. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a different, let's see, that you had asked something different. I'm trying to find, oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to find that image again, and I can't find it. So I need to look at that. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can find that on my different screen, so that I don't mess up the interface here. And we'll see. So these are the questions to start us off. What does metacognition and metacognitive knowledge and teaching look like here? Is that included here? Obviously, I am coming into this space and this without training, specific training as a physician, and that's both helpful and not helpful, because I have a different perspective on things, but I also haven't gone through the training. So, so I'm curious to hear from all of you who have. Would metacognitive teaching can be connected to individualized teaching? Yeah, so there are certainly ways to do that. I would pose that to the group. Does anyone want to take Farah's question and respond to that? Yes.
Can you hear me, Jonathan? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I guess like I can sort of have a go at Farah's question. In a sense, expand it, because I have the same question. If we say metacognition is, in a sense, thinking about how you think, I'm struggling with how it differs from experience. In other words, if we take a learner who is trying to learn material, so we're starting at the ground level, right? The learner does not know the material, and it's trying to learn the material. And then we are saying that if you bring in metacognition, we're talking about the learner's ability to learn. In other words, thinking about how you think about that learning material
Mhm.
And for me as an instructor, I associate that with the instructor. We worry about how we present the material to the learner. The learner is not confident, doesn't know the material, and it's probably not even gone past that first step to the second step of worrying about how they think about how they manage the material that they don't already know. So it seems to me that teaching metacognition and individualized teaching, from my understanding, it just seems to me like it's running at cross purposes. One's for the instructor, the other one's for the individual, unless my understanding is wrong. And that's where I guess it'd be interesting to see what people's thoughts are. But I have a difficulty with metacognition and a learner. I tend to see it as an instructor's attribute rather than a learner's attribute. But I mean, I can understand it as an advanced learner. So if you get someone who's an instructor wants to learn something new, then I can understand where metacognition comes in. So that brings me to the question I had: what's the difference between metacognition and experience? Because now we've gone from the learner to the instructor. I know it's a long-winded sort of like explanation, but those were my thoughts.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I would pose that to the group. And does anyone want to respond to Raj or tug at any of the strings of that question?
Hi, Jonathan, is Jonas here.
Yes, please,
yes,
go ahead.
Yes, I just want to just congratulate you on this initiative. I think it's very interesting and necessary. And I was wondering, I mean, you did say that we need to have metacognition in our session learning outcomes. Now that would be quite a kind of difficult. So I was wondering whether this session that you are giving to us is also given in some form to the students, so they understand that metacognition is an important part of their learning practice. Because responding to what has been posted on the chat, in my experience, when I talk to students, advisees, especially in the first year, I think students have metacognition. They understand from those I've spoken to that they've come to medical school, and within the first week or two, they realize the amount of information is so much learning materials, and they have all these flip sessions and this and this and that, and they tell me all the time, they're trying to navigate away an optimum approach to study the material. So I really do think these are students who have gone through college, they have some experience in learning at college, but this is a different kind of material, and they do that. And usually towards the end of the first semester, when I meet them, they seem to have some kind of approach. They tell me which resources are useful to them, how they are going to approach it, and they are so varied. I mean, they have some that are so interesting. So I won't give you the different stories I hear. So I think it's a very good session, but the students need to understand that maybe sharpening their understanding of how they learn will improve. And they have different learning styles and different strategies. So I do think they are aware of their learning strategies, their strengths, their weaknesses, sometimes based upon their background. So I think it's a good material, but students need to probably be exposed to that. And I like the fact that you broke down the types of knowledge from Anderson and Krautwerk's paper to factual, conceptual, procedural, metacognition. Our students are stuck in factual. If you ask me, they're just so much interested. Some of the self-reflection things that I read that the curriculum make them do, very interesting, very useful. They are telling me how they have gone through 50 Anki cards in one day or 1 week, and they are so happy because they are just trying to memorize so much of information. And you know very well that they'll forget this soon after the exams. So they're stuck too much in rehearsing for the exams and not getting deeper into conceptual learning or some kind of application to the clinical scenarios. So I think it's a good journey that you've started, but it has to be in two directions, to faculty and to students for maximum benefit. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And I think that your point is a very good one, because if we don't, it sort of echoes, what Pintrick is saying, of course, which is, yeah, we need to teach our students this, and we need to do it We need to do it explicitly. But I think also it's important to conceive of what that might look like. It might look like offering a cognitive tool, a metacognitive tool to a student. I think that probably if we were to delve into all of our teaching practices of what we do and the things that we say when we're with our students, we would discover that we actually do a fair bit of metacognitive instruction. But probably right now it is implicit most of the time, because we haven't thought to say, hey, and this is a metacognitive strategy. We haven't stopped to label it because we're just having the conversation and we never thought of that. So I can give you an example of this. It need not be burdensome or onerous, I think, is my point, and it need not be equivalent amounts of content load for the student. It can be a tool or a strategy that we use in a particular context that we say, hey, and I do it this way. I think about how, so on a very simple level, I might, with my students, when I am, so last week I had some students ask me about an analysis paper that they're writing. This was for a class that I'm teaching at Cal State San Bernardino, University of Redlands. I'm teaching these students how to write this analysis paper, and none of them have ever written this kind of analysis paper before. And so they're struggling with understanding what do I do with this text? You've told me I've got to use this text and analyze this. I say yes. And so then, and they say, and I got to use this other text. So I got these two texts you want me to write about. What do you want me to do with this? And so I asked them, one of the metacognitive tools that I gave them was to, stop and ask yourself, how am I thinking about this? How am I positioning this assignment in my head? Because if you position it a certain way, it will make sense. If you don't have it positioned in that way, the assignment will be very difficult. And so I have them position that assignment in the context of two texts talking back as a conversation between the two texts. And so they write that paper in a conversational manner between those two texts. And that helps them understand, I understand how a conversation works. This text will speak. What do I do if I put these texts together, and what do I discover? That's the point of the assignment, is for them to do that analysis and that exploration. My metacognitive instruction was to say, pause for a moment. You're confused. Notice that you're confused. And you're reaching for strategies and those aren't working. So let's think about what strategy would work for you. Remember when I said, put this into conversation? Oh, yes, I remember that. Okay, try that. And then they do it and they go, oh, it works. And then I say another metacognitive piece of instruction. I say, now just think about your confusion level before. What were you thinking, and where was your mental attention when I gave you this tool? What happened inside your head? It all of a sudden snapped into focus, and they go, oh, you're right. And so I say, now I want you to remember that feeling, because when you're feeling unfocused and you're not sure what to do the next time, remember that you need to reach for the right tool in that moment. And it will probably be one that we have gone over in class, because they were reaching for all the tools except the one that they needed, right? And so I had them stop and think through their own cognitive process. What am I doing? Where am I reaching? Oh, I'm not reaching for the right tool. And then my instruction was reach for the right tool, right? So that is what it looked like for me in my teaching on a very, very practical level. And it was like a phrase of guidance. And it's easy to overlook. My point here, as I'm going on and on, my point here is that it's easy to overlook the kinds of instruction that we do and think that we're not instructing enough metacognitively. But these typically metacognitive instruction, it doesn't take a lot of time. It's a very small thing where when we ask the student to attend to their thought process. And so it's thinking of any tool like that, any approach like that. I like Gordon's comment, drinking from a fire hose. And then Raj asks another question, and I invite you, Raj, to feel free to jump in if you would like. Would a learner developing a better strategy to memorize better be considered a metacognitive strategy? I would invite, what do you all think there? Let's toss that out there. Is that an example of a metacognitive strategy?
Well, I think from reading the paper, I think I recall what he was trying to explain is the higher level of memorizing is using mnemonics. So using mnemonics is probably a higher strategy, but it does not, I don't think it gets to the level of metacognition. Metacognition is students understanding their limitations, their strengths, and adopting strategies to learn. Now, I think in the medical education, the important thing is not factual because they can always Google for the answer. The important thing is application of knowledge in a new context. So they learn about something in a clinical case, they can pull out the relevant factors and apply it to a new context. And that application is what is important. But that does not even reach metacognition. It's application level, whether you consider the original Bloom taxonomy or the revised. So I wouldn't think learning to memorize is a form of well, maybe it is.
I think you're right. Oh, I'm sorry. Go.
I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, didn't mean to interrupt you, Jonas. I think that you're right, Jonas. The use of a mnemonic to memorize is not it would be the selection of it, the identification of, okay, what strategy am I going to be using? That is the metacognitive piece, because it's assessing the task, it's assessing the tools that you have at your disposal that you may have learned, which is, oh, we learned this metacognitive, or we didn't learn. We learned a mnemonic, or even constructing one would be a high-level metacognitive exercise. Constructing your own tool to meet a certain need because you've assessed that you need a tool here in order to learn better. That is metacognitive. The actual memorization where you're drilling, that is not a metacognitive activity, but it's the engagement of the assessment of yourself, the student's assessment of themselves, and then the construction of something to help them, and the implication of that. So, or the introduction of that into their thinking. I want to read, so Aaron has posted something which you probably have all read by now, but one of the places that students are expected to practice and develop their metacognitive skills is expressed in PLO 5. Students are expected to identify strengths, deficiencies, and limits in one's knowledge and expertise and set learning and improvement goals. Yeah, absolutely, that is metacognitive. One place this is meant to be practiced is in the weekly clinical cases. Yes. The way they are meant to do this is through writing their own session objectives. Is this a metacognitive strategy? And are there other exercises we could consider doing with the students in the cases to meet this programmatic outcome? I think it's a great question. It's starting to pick up in the chat, so that's great. And Frank says, simply put, teaching students how to think is more important than what to think. And Frank, thanks for coming. So take care. Thinking about and deciding to use the right tools will be positive. Yes.
May I ask a question? This is Susan Yazdanmer. I was wondering if you think that this is something that is also discipline oriented under the area of the general medicine. Also, we do have different basic sciences. Like I believe maybe metacognition is more important in physiology than pharmacology. Would it, because pharmacology, basically you need to memorize lots of facts about many medicines, and by itself, out of the context of the application to the clinical setting and to the patients, it's memorization. What do you think about that?
I appreciate your question, Susan. I want to get Gordon, who has raised his hand and who may be commenting on this. I'm not sure. Gordon, were you responding to that? Get anything to develop?
Nope, I've got something else.
Okay. Before we come to Gordon, so I think Susan, that metacognition is going to be important in every field and in every discipline, but it may look different and it may be used in slightly different ways. So one of the things in terms of, pharmacology is also application. Yeah. So it's in the selection, and it's in self-monitoring. So anytime that you have, as physicians, I mean, you're self-monitoring all the time, and I know that, and I'm not even one. But as professionals and as experts, we self-monitor all the time, especially when we are engaged in practice. When I'm teaching, I'm self-monitoring all the time. The self-monitoring is the metacognitive practice that's going on. And so selection of tools, assessing your own strengths and weaknesses in a given situation. And I think that there's a significant component to metacognition that is deeply linked to clinical reasoning, which we haven't talked about, and which I have never had formal instruction in, but I have heard my colleagues talking about it enough. And I think that it's really a fascinating thing, and it's deeply linked, I think, to metacognition because, well, there's some things there. So I think that it would be. I just want to be cautious by saying I don't think that there are disciplines where metacognition is not appropriate to apply. I think it applies universally in all areas of study, but it may not look quite the same necessarily. The tools that you reach for may be slightly different. So Gordon, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you very much for bringing this up. So I put a couple of things in here about clinical reasoning diagnostic processes, and they're very similar. So as a first-year medical student advances to become an expert clinician, they go through a series of stages. And part of that has to do with what you're discussing with metacognition. So an expert physician cross-carries dual process theory, which is a pretty reasonable way of looking at the way in which experts make decisions. There's kind of two processes. One is I see it and I automatically know it. I know this is a case of whatever. If you were to ask me why, I may not actually be able to tell you exactly why I know it, but I know it. It's a heuristic. And then, as a medical student, you wouldn't have that because you haven't got that experience, that number of cases, and the number of cases that are similar but different in the ability to distinguish between them. So you do a type 2 process, which is sorting through all of the information and, eventually coming up with a decision. But experts use type 2 as well in novel situations where there are ill-defined information. And in that way, the expert has learned exactly what you're talking about. They have learned to identify when they don't know what they don't know, and then be able to switch gears and use a different set of tools in order to move along. So, and the comment I put about habit is I think that even with metacognition, if you're constantly thinking about the way you think and about the way in which you problem solve and the way in which you take tests and the way in which you do whatever, and you focus in on that, those will become more and more habitual based on the same scenarios you come up with, and you'll get better and better at them, and you won't have to think about them as much. So, my 2 cents.
Well, thanks for your 2 cents. Appreciate it. So at this point, I just want to take a pause, a very brief pause, and it's my intention that these sessions not run all the way up to the hour, because I know that people have different meetings to get to, and having kind of a passing period in between meetings and sessions is very helpful. So I wanted to begin to wrap this up and invite any last questions or thoughts. We've had some good conversation here, and my hope too is we continue these conversations in the halls. Not that we run into each other in the halls all that much anymore because so many of us are remote, but as we run into the digital halls of our institution, and as we see each other in our team meetings and have these snippets and moments of time, I hope that these ideas are kind of ringing around in our heads, and that we're thinking about them and what they mean to our practice. So does anyone have any last thoughts or comments if you weren't able to share or ask?
Yes, Jonathan, I was wondering too, I mean, this is a very useful initiative, and whether one approach is to maximize the benefit to faculty and students. At some point to have like a panel discussion with the students on how they think about their learning, and then people like God, they can share their own perspective. It's because I think the students take quite a long time to navigate and find strategies to deal with this information when they get here. So this session, I think, would be useful if it's possible, arrange some kind of an open discussion with the students, so you know how they think, and we understand how they think. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that suggestion. I appreciate you thinking that this is valuable. I love sitting and talking about metacognition. It's my jam, and I love exploring how it applies in new contexts. And so I would love to have conversations with students about it. And so we'll see if we can set something up appropriately. Raj poses one last question, and then I'll pose that, and then we'll call it a day. Is thinking about this faculty development metacognition. I love it. I would say, to nerd out on that question. If we are, as you are reading the article and learning something new, if you intentionally thought about any strategy, any cognitive strategy, even from something as simple as, I'm going to read this article, and you start reading through it and you think, wait, I'm not sure I understand how this is organized, you would probably have engaged in a metacognitive decision that you weren't aware of, and stopped reading that first paragraph or that second paragraph, wherever you were, and pulled out and looked at the headings of the article. Even something as simple as that was a metacognitive decision, because you changed your strategy and approach and decided, I want to get a bigger view. I want to get an overview on the structure of this article. Where is he going? How have they organized? How has Pinterest organized this piece? And then you might take a look at those headings and then go, okay, I think I get it. And you might say, yeah, I'm going to read the conclusion and see if his main idea is there. Scan the conclusion real quick, and then you go back to the beginning and start reading through it. Those would definitely be metacognitive decisions and metacognitive processes or strategies. So, thank you all so much for being here. Before I turn I'm going to stop sharing. Hold on a second. You see this? Hold on. Thank you for coming. I hope that this was helpful, and I want to invite you to next month's session. And every month we will have a different person sharing an article, a piece of literature, and then kind of facilitating a discussion through that. And it will all center on high impact teaching practices, best practices in teaching. And so next month, join us for Dr. Green. Dr. Green will be here and we'll be facilitating that. And so that should be a good session. Also keep a lookout for our emails. We've been sending so many right now, since we're kind of getting them going, you probably can't miss them. But please take a look at those, and there will be opportunities to register for sessions that we're doing through Zoom. We're trying to manage our attendance that way, but we welcome you to those. And there's going to be this session, which is focused on practices and strategy, or practices and theory. And there's also going to be one toward the end of the month that will be a time for faculty and teachers to come to get together and talk shop. One of the most valuable things that teachers can do is to just have a space where you can talk about, what strategies do you use? What tools do you use in the classroom or in that teaching environment, whether it's clinical or in a classroom? And so that will be happening coming up, and Dr. Jacobs will be facilitating that first one and sharing a tool of his own. But come to that session with some tools. Be ready to share some tools and things that you do in your teaching. So thank you all. There will be a link, if there isn't already, a link to a survey that you can use, and we would just love your feedback on this, and that'll be an ongoing regular thing. So if we don't get it out here in the chat, we'll email it to everyone. So thanks a lot. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next month for the same session and for the series.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot.